fridge is going to regulate the air temperature in the fridge. You want to
That's right.
remove the thermostat from the fridge and place the thermostat directly on your bottle. And then it's going to be regulating, or your bucket, or whatever it is. And it's going to be regulating the temperature of your must, not the temperature of the air. So if you are regulating the temperature of the air, yeah, you've often got to drop it colder because the must is going to be a bit warmer. But if you have a sensor directly on it, then you can just set it at 16 or 62, as you like to call it over there, and then it will stay there. And if the must starts making more, the fridge will automatically start working harder.
That's correct. Yep. And so then the last phase they go to is in this stationary phase. At some point, well, even within the first few days, we've got yeast that are already dying and falling to the bottom, or at least they're going dormant. Now, this is something that a lot of people misunderstand. When the yeast hit their alcohol tolerance level, they don't die of alcohol poisoning, people. They just don't have the ability anymore for some reason to make any more ethanol. So people think that as soon as they hit their tolerance level, they die of alcohol poisoning. They don't. They just go dormant. They stop working.
I think it's a self-defense mechanism. If you were to add ethanol to it, you could probably alcohol poison them to death, like a fortified something.
Yes,
but if you're just leaving them to their own devices where they're the ones that are making the only ethanol involved, they're going to stop before they actually kill themselves. I mean, otherwise the species doesn't proceed, right?
Let's anthropomorphize a little bit here and say that most of the time people don't get alcohol poisoning. Most of the time they're going to pass out and stop drinking before they get alcohol poisoning, and that's what we're getting at. If you do drink something incredibly high in alcohol and lots of it, like AJ said, there's a fair chance it'll kill them. But if you're just drinking the same mead that you've been drinking all night long, at some point you're just going to be in a puddle on the floor. Oh, hopefully not a puddle. But, you understand where I'm coming from.
Absolutely.
And the yeast is going to do the same thing. It's just going to not be able to function well before it gets bad enough that it's going to kill it.
That's right. Now, if you guys don't think this is true, I just challenge you then to take and run something until the term that I like to use is the yeast tap out, right? Let them sit there for 6 months and then add some water to dilute the alcohol. Or if they get stuck because of the pH, add some water to dilute the pH, and they'll go back to fermenting again. And that's why we hear about bottle bombs. Mm-hmm. I think one of my friends on God Mead spoke once that he had some wine, I believe, that sat for 2.5 years, and nothing happened. And then 2.5 years later, it started back up fermenting just out of the blue for no particular given reason.
Sometimes it could be the acid softening to a less acidic acid, and sometimes it can be from a temperature fluctuation that can cause them to kick back up.
That's true. So this kind of, we're almost done, guys. Just hang on. We're trying to wrap it up now. With when they make beer, sometimes they'll raise the temperatures in the stationary phase just a little bit. That kind of spurs the yeast on a little bit. They call it a Diacetyl Rest. And you might find that by doing that, it will help the yeast to kind of maybe it's that last final push when you're all sprinting to the finish line to try to see who's first. I know one of the problems I see, especially in the wine world, is that people want to rack their fermentation when they get to like 1010 or 1020. Well, they're removing their biomass from their ferment, and then they wonder why it stalls. Well, you just took the biomass away. The reason they do that is because they're afraid of off flavors. Now, I understand if you've got a boatload of solids, that can start to give off some vegetal notes, but you should be keeping the stuff cool enough that it's no different than having your grapes in the refrigerator than it is in your must. I personally like to let my yeast stay in my batch for almost a month, probably. Now, it ebbs and flows a little bit, but I like to leave my yeast in my must for a month after the gravity stops moving. Now, what I do so it doesn't cause any problems is I continue every day. This is something I do every day. Is I what we call rouse the lees. I'll get something, usually my lee stir, turned on real low. But even once my fermentation is over, I still stir my lees every day to keep them up in suspension. What they do is they're going to start eating some of the byproducts, some of the leftover job site construction mess. They'll start eating some of that up. When some of them die, or I guess even when they're still alive, they will start to absorb some of those things. So a lot of what we try to age out in our must over time, if you will leave it on the lees for a longer period of time, the yeast will do that. And I've also found that there absolutely must be some integration going on and some binding, because I have found that if I stir my lees for 3 or 4 weeks longer than the fermentation has stopped, as soon as I stop stirring them, they start dropping out way faster than what they drop out real early on in the. And I believe it's because they've bound. They started to flocculate better, and so all of our molecular weights are much heavier than what they would have been a month earlier, and so they drop out real quick. Now, the only time that I wouldn't keep my stuff on the lees in suspension is if I had a reductive batch, meaning I had some sulfur issues. If I had a dirty batch for some reason, and honestly, and I'm not tapping myself on the back at all, but I have not ever had a dirty batch since I started using GoFirm, Fermado, oxygen, and stirring my lees. I don't have dirty batches, and I don't expect that you should either if you do all of these things right. But if I do have a reductive batch, or if you do, I would suggest to get your fermentation off the lees as soon as you can, because those sulfur compounds will bind to other things in your mead, and you're going to have a hard time if you leave the sulfur compounds in there for very long to get rid of them. Immediately, if you get those, you want to stir the crap out of your yeast and try to aerate it off. And I don't know, too many people want to throw some food at their yeast at this point, but if it's later on in the fermentation, it's too late. You have to be proactive against this stuff so it doesn't happen. I've recently started to read information. I think we've known for a long time that yeast can't assimilate DAP after 9% ABV, which is almost generally about 1/3 sugar break anyway. I'm starting to see new information leaking out a little bit that they're starting to believe that maybe the yeast can't assimilate anything after that third sugar break, or roughly the 9-10% ABV. So if you're late in the ferment and you're throwing stuff at it, hoping that it's not going to stink anymore, it's very good chance it's already too late for that.
Although I think I've had a couple where I've done that and just tossed some nuked bread yeast in, and it did tidy things up. So either what I threw in was absorbing the odor,
right?
Or they were able to assimilate some of the stuff I put in there.
Yep, they could be, but I know that when they die, they actually act as sponges and they start absorbing some of those things too. But
yeah, so it's possible just putting in yeast corpses was helping too.
That's right. I always have. I don't ever have to use them, but I have a whole little half of an oil can, or half of a Pepsi can actually, of yeast hulls for that very reason. And then lastly, if you can't stir that out and you can't absorb it out, get it off the lees as soon as it's finished. There's a product made by Lalvin called I don't know how they pronounce it, Regules or Reduless, I'm not sure, but it's spelled Reduless. And there's some other things too that you can add that will actually go in and bind with those sulfur compounds and cause it to drop out. The only batch I ever did have that was a little bit stinky, I found out it was probably twofold. I still had some SO2 in my must. Back then, I used to put SO2 in my must get rid of all the bad guys before I pitched my yeast, and I think when I pitched there was still too much in there. But I also used apricots, dried apricots, which already have
naturally have some sulfites in them.
Exactly, yeah. Okay. So, but I then took a piece of copper plumbing, a piece of copper tubing. I cleaned it real good, bought it brand new at the store. I cleaned it real good, and then I dangled it in my carboy overnight on a piece of fishing monofilament, and that took care of my sulfur notes. But I've been told to not do that. Just a second, Hamish. Yep. Don't use the copper if your ferment's actively working. I don't know why, but I've been told by somebody that I trust, and I need to ask them why, but I've been told to not do that when you have an active ferment.
Okay, so just to clarify there, the dried apricots, it's actually an addition in order to keep the nice, pretty orange color. They're covered in sulfur. So be very careful with a lot of dried fruits because they come covered, and I mean like swimming in sulfur. Which leads me to people who claim they have allergies to sulfur. If you can eat dried fruit, you don't have a sulfur allergy. It's something else.
That's right.
Now, moving on back up to sulfur issues in your wine. Yes, copper is really good at stripping stuff out and creating solids that will precipitate out of your mead. It will strip out flavor, it will strip out color, it will strip out smell, and it will strip out the nasty stuff. So be very careful using it. Use it as a last resort. And yeah, I don't know why either, but don't use it in an active ferment. I'm not across that, but nobody uses copper in an active ferment. Jaden also asked us to explain and elaborate on sugar breaks. Now, as I understand it, you're referring to the 1/3 sugar break. What we talk about there is we're going to expect, let's say you've started off your must at 1.100. We're going to break that 100 up into 3 sections. So your first sugar break will be around about 1.066. Your next one will be at 1.033. So what we're saying when we refer to the third sugar break is don't feed your must after it's used up 1/3 of the sugar. Is basically all there is to it there.
Now, Ryan, do you use the TOSNA protocols?
I do. I was doing something actually, and this isn't to steal anything from Sergio, but that's the exact same stuff that you'll find in our 2017 handbook that we've talked about. And so Sergio took that right out of the handbook. And so I've been doing that. I did it on my own before I knew of Sergio's TOSNA. And actually early on, I started using the Fermento almost as soon as it came out. And we had a huge, I think it's maybe the second biggest thread on Gottmead. And I started it out saying, hey, you guys, I think we're overfeeding the little ones. And this got into this huge, like 7 or 8 page, maybe only 6 pages, but the real long thread. And we were having all these great, wonderful scientific talks about yeast, the Yan calculations that we were using, and I actually invited Sergio over there to clarify some things for us, because in the handbook they talked about, what's the phrase they use? They have this like an effectiveness clause saying that the TOSNA, the Fermento has the effective results of more than what you're actually using, and so that we've got kind of some of the more scientifically minded people, we got into a little bit of a wrestling match, and Sergio came over and talked about that, and it was probably 4 months later after he read through all of that he went back and revised the TOSNA into the TOSNA 2.0, saying that I think we need to use less if we have fruits in our, if we're making mells and whatnot. And so, yes, for our listeners, TOSNA works, and it works fabulously. There's some different places you can get that information, but meadmaderight.com is where the TOSNA protocol is there. We have a calculator on Got Mead, and there's also a batch builder on Meadmaker.com as well. So, and I meant to ask you, AJ, I bought and sent you some Fermado and some Go Firm.
I know, and it's still sitting